Skeena, Bulkley, Kispiox, Babine, a system of rivers like no other. Threading a rugged paradise, these fertile waters weave an elaborate living tapestry. Here in the pristine wilderness of northwestern British Columbia, life abounds. At the heart of this abundance is the amazing Pacific salmon. World-famous runs of all 6 species fight their way up the Skeena to the very lakes and streams where they were hatched. The watershed contains over 70 wild salmon stocks, each one genetically unique. Salmon are exceptionally sensitive to changes in their habitat and reflect the health or degradation of the environment itself. The ancient progenitor of all Pacific salmon is the steelhead, rarest and most primitive of the salmonids. These extraordinary fish are a biological marvel. They live longer and migrate farther than any other salmon. After spawning, they don't die, but return to the ocean to repeat their migratory cycle. Their striking beauty and fiery spirit make Skeena Steelhead one of the world's most treasured game fish. As wild nature is steadily tamed, the steelhead has become a symbol of survival. Salmonids are valued by many kinds of people in many different ways. The renowned runs of Chinook, coho, and steelhead in the Skeena and its tributaries attract anglers from around the world. Native Indians have harvested salmon from these waters for thousands of years. Until recently, their fishery was non-commercial, restricted to providing food for their own communities. The commercial net fishery is by far the largest consumer of salmon. The massive exploitation of species like pink and sockeye sustains a billion-dollar industry. Unfortunately, the commercial nets are indiscriminate. In the course of catching the target species, they also kill vast numbers of other fish migrating to spawning grounds. Over the decades, runs of less abundant stocks have been virtually destroyed.
For all the species of salmon, there are, some stocks that are, some species that are capable of much higher rates of harvesting than others. But, you can't go out and try and catch pink or Chinook salmon and tell the steelhead and the Chinook or the coho, please don't come into the nets. So there's this bycatch of species and stocks that are not as productive that get taken anyway. And certainly, as the years go by, there's more and more of those unproductive, relatively unproductive stocks that are falling by the wayside.
Steelhead have started to get into trouble, I guess, in the last 10 or 15, 20 years, really badly. In my lifetime, of course, I've seen them change from where they're everywhere until they're a little difficult to find, until they're looking as if they're in trouble. And recreational fishermen, especially sport fishermen, began to cast about what the cause of it was, and we have appreciated very early that the real cause was the salmon nets, the commercial fishery, the market fishery intercepting the steelhead.
Commercial fish boats have scoured the Skeena River estuary for 100 years. A flotilla of seine boats, trollers, and gill netters intercepts steelhead and salmon migrating upstream. Although today's boats are more powerful, efficient, and expensive than ever before, the technology of the tidewater fishery has changed remarkably little since the early days.
Silvery deep of the beautiful Skeena and Fraser rivers of British Columbia, and out of the coastal waters along the shores of Canada's fair Pacific province, there come each year nearly 250 million pounds of salmon to help feed a hungry world. There are several methods employed to catch these tasty fish. These fishermen use the gill net method, and here we see but a few of a total of 6,000 small boats which do duty in gill net fishing. Gill net is so called because the mesh is so designed that when a fish swims against it, its gills become caught in the mesh.
Historically, the fishing industry has viewed salmon as an inexhaustible resource. One by one, many of the greatest salmon runs in the world have been decimated. Whenever productivity started to fall, boats would simply shift to a new area or a different species. There always seemed to be more of the silver hordes ready to fill the nets. Today, the commercial fleet carries on full steam ahead. Salmon fishing is big business indeed. Thousands of jobs on the decks and in the canneries. Millions of dollars in bank loans for boats and gear. The capacity of the net fleet that musters in Prince Rupert Harbor is bigger than ever, despite the serious decline of coho, chinook, and steelhead in the Skeena. Conservation of tidewater stocks is the responsibility of the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans. After ignoring the steelhead problem for decades, DFO recently pledged to reduce the incidental bycatch by 50% within 3 years. However, DFO has traditionally functioned as a handmaiden to the industry.
We have to balance the needs of the commercial fleet and the sports fishing community, and we are committed to the 50% reduction. How will it go about achieving that in the next 2 years? We have to consult with the commercial fleet and try to find a way that we meet the objective while at the same time minimizing the impact on the commercial fleet.
DFO's prime mandate is to manage the resource for the conservation of stocks before meeting the needs of user groups. Nevertheless, the demands of the industry have reigned supreme at the expense of one stock after another. Unfortunately, overfishing is only one of the threats facing salmon populations. Habitat destruction also takes its toll. Critical spawning grounds and salmon-rearing streams have frequently been devastated by poor logging practices, careless road building, pulp mill pollution, and urban development. Economic pressures usually win out over biological needs, even when tiny changes in the temperature or quality of water can spell disaster for an entire salmon run. By the 1950s, the decline of British Columbia's wild salmon stocks had reached critical proportions. Scientists responded with a technical fix to improve on nature with artificial enhancement. The government built elaborate swimways and enormous hatcheries wherever salmon populations were in trouble. The world's largest system of spawning channels was constructed on the Fulton River to help Skeena sockeye find their way home. Although enhancement caused some salmon stocks to surge, it created new problems of its own.
The ideal enhancement measure is one that interferes as little as possible with the natural lifestyle of the fish, if you like, so that habitat protection and habitat improvement are the safest way to go. Well, that way you get natural stocks of fish and they are reproducing naturally. The more you get away from the natural life, the greater is the risk that you're going to expose the animals to disease, you're going to change the genetic structure of the population. As far as possible, you should invest your effort in habitat protection, habitat enhancement. Things of that kind are much to be preferred to concrete palaces for raising fish to be sent out to sea.
As a public relations gesture, hatcheries have served the Department of Fisheries well. By pumping up populations of target species for the commercial fleet, DFO has been able to sidestep its responsibility for managing wild stocks. As long as the nets are full, fishermen don't care whether the salmon were hatched in a tray. But over time, the biological cost of artificial enhancement is seen in a gradual erosion of the wild gene pool. Hatchery fish are less robust than wild and lack adaptive traits evolved through natural selection. When multitudes of hatchery fry are released, they compete with wild stocks for food. The effect on many runs of Pacific salmon has been catastrophic. DFO's enhancement program constitutes a massive subsidy for the commercial fleet. Incredibly, it costs more to fill the sea with salmon and to keep the fishery going than the entire industry generates in revenue. Out on the ocean, the fleet scoops up the bounty from the hatcheries. Along with runs of enhanced salmon, the wall of nets traps rarer stocks as well. At the mouth of the Skeena, as many as 9 out of 10 steelhead trying to enter the river end up tangled in twine. Chasing millions of salmon around the ocean seems a peculiar way to harvest fish. As many as 1,000 boats jostle for space to string out their enormous nets. Some openings last just a few hours, and the stampede for salmon is like a feeding frenzy. Within a couple of weeks, the fish that escaped the onslaught are making their way upriver. Compared to the commercial fleet, sport fishing on the Skeena is a relatively civilized affair. The famous runs of salmon and steelhead have sustained a thriving recreational industry for decades. In fact, when all the guides, equipment, and support services are taken into account, BC's sport fishery actually earns more than the commercial industry. Unlike the net fleet, the province's 400,000 anglers require little government subsidy and don't deplete wild stocks. Less abundant species are caught for sport, then released back into the river. Because anglers take less than 5% of the total catch, they have never been treated very seriously by the Department of Fisheries. Yet it is the sport fishing community that has sounded the alarm, as steelhead populations have plummeted over the years.
1963, we moved up here. My husband, Jim Walker, was a Geordie from England, and he was looking for a place, a fishing place, and a place that wasn't too isolated. So we built our cabins, and the fishing was, of course, absolutely, completely marvelous. People would pass through the camp, and the majority were U.S., people from every part of Europe, and they would just go wild about this river because it is beautiful, it is easy to fish, and it's a great place to be.
2 South American visitors and a guide set out for steelhead in the Kispiox River. Thanks to the advice of the guide, each got a strike on his second cast. The first came in as only a 6-pounder, not so the second. It tossed, turned, tugged, and twisted, full of strange tricks. For 3/4 of a mile, inch by inch, it dragged our man's line up and down, glued itself to the bottom, worked him with and against the current, sent the reels screaming until at one stage of the game there was little line left to work on. A 26-pound prince of trout after a great battle.
Today, the fabled summer runs of wild Skeena steelhead and coho have almost disappeared. Streams that used to sparkle with the flash of silver are now empty. Once prolific spawning beds lie undisturbed and barren. In one lifetime, an ecological wonder thousands of years in the making has been virtually extinguished.
I've been gathering data for the last 30 years in the Kispiox, and I have kept records of fish caught, on the reel and on the fly, and it just hasn't been good the last few years. And the summer steelhead just practically disappeared. Like when people ask me when to come, and I said either end of September or into October. And October, you have to take a risk on the weather, because that's when we often have storms and floods and all kinds of things. So that's the way it is.
Just 15 years ago, the limit for anglers was 40 steelhead per year. Today, it is none. Through their time on the river, however, enthusiasts maintain a first-hand knowledge of how wild stocks are faring.
In the 6 years that I've been in the Skeena region, we've seen the steelhead abundance decline by probably in the order of 75%. In any given year, there's going to be natural fluctuations in abundance brought about by environmental conditions. But the problem we face here, of course, is that whatever nature serves us up is basically cut in half by the exploitation subsequent to the commercial and the native in-river fisheries, primarily the commercial fishery itself.
The fish which enter the river at that time are a very distinct genetic component compared with any other element of the population. So on Skeena, we still have that incredibly important, unmolested, wild gene pool that's ours to treasure and ours to sustain. And the importance of wild anything in today's world, I think, is just increasing exponentially.
It may well be that we've already lost a lot of our stocks, our smaller, weak stocks in the province already, and that process will continue. But that's part and parcel of taking the full-scale harvest from the most productive stocks of the most productive species. So in some ways, it's an inevitable consequence of the way in which the whole fishery is conducted.
The Skeena watershed is perhaps the finest salmon habitat in North America. Natives called this river Water of the Clouds. For more than 50 centuries, Indians here depended on migrating salmon and steelhead. To the carrier, Tsimshian, Gitsan, and Wet'suwet'en, the fish were more than food. They were life itself. The arrival of the salmon every spring was a promise of survival. The first Chinook of the season was honored with ritual celebration. A bountiful harvest meant food for the entire year. Native people still fish for salmon on the Skeena, although outboards and gill nets are now common. At traditional fishing sites like Morristown Canyon, Indians scramble over the same outcroppings as their ancestors to reap the silver harvest. Using gaffs and dip nets, the native fishery isn't as selective as it could be. Too many Chinook and steelhead are caught needlessly. Gaffing is a controversial technique that subjects many fish to abuse.
Well, we've done a lot of work on looking at the issue of gaffing in the Morristown Canyon and other canyons that we have on our territories. The one in Morristown is the most visible one, and what we're looking at is to try to get people from the different house groups to control the fishing sites and the fishing holes that are in the canyon, possibly looking at closing some of the fishing sites down, particularly the ones where we know that the holes are being used to take certain species, particularly the Chinook and other species like coho or any other species that we know that are weak, that will close those holes down so that people won't be able to gaff. The Kiksan-Mukoden have made a decision to return to our traditional way of fishing, and that's to use the weirs and fish traps so that we could do selective harvesting. And next year we're going to test some more of those traps and those weirs.
The objective with alternative technologies like this fish wheel is to facilitate sorting by species while the salmon are still alive. Strong stocks are kept, weak ones released. It's not a new idea. Through history, natives have employed selective techniques in salmon streams throughout the province. Using river seine nets and fish traps, they took all the fish they needed, and salmon stocks remained healthy. However, with the advent of the commercial industry on the coast, everything changed. Laws were passed banning the Indians' traditional methods, and they were given jobs on boats and in canneries. Today, natives have started using beach seines again for their in-river fisheries. In the 1920s, companies built efficient commercial fish traps at the mouth of the Skeena to intercept migrating salmon. However, the owners of canneries and net boats saw a threat to their control of the resource and had in-river traps banned. The age of the commercial fleet had begun. Today, salmon fishing is a high-stakes, capital-intensive game. A few big corporate players hold all the cards. When more than 15 million salmon are caught each season, many people can't understand why there's such a fuss about a few thousand steelhead.
Steelhead is, as it's often portrayed as a conservation problem, when in fact it's not. What we're dealing is with an allocation problem. The steelhead catches on the Skeena River by the commercial fleet have not changed over the last 25 years. This is according to DFO and provincial figures. What we're looking at is changes in economies in the North Coast, whereby economies in the central interior are looking to develop sport fishing and, opportunities and economic development based on sports fishing. Pressure is therefore being put on the commercial fishing industry to release more steelhead to get upriver.
Anglers, however, aren't just crying for a bigger piece of the pie. They're fighting to save a vanishing treasure. Although the annual catch of Skeena steelhead by the commercial fleet has been constant, the proportion this represents of the remaining fish has risen dangerously. The difference between intercepting 1/4 and 1/2 of a remnant wild population can be the difference between survival and extinction. Responding to public concern, DFO initiated an experimental steelhead rescue program in 1992. Some gillnetters tried saving steelhead from their nets and passing them onto a rescue boat. Although about 400 fish were eventually released to continue up the Skeena, the token project was less of a conservation measure than it was a public relations effort.
First tagged steelhead released from the commercial fishery was caught just this week up in the Kitwanga area, about 100 miles upstream of the commercial fishery. This has shown us and encourages us that the program is a success and will work.
Trying to get them out of gill nets is a little unrealistic. A lot of the fish are going to be killed in a gill net, and taking them out is not going to be easy on them in any event. So you really have to replace gill nets if you want to really cut back on the harvest of incidental species like steelhead or chinook or coho or whatever.
For threatened salmonid populations on the Skeena, the status quo spells disaster. Their future depends on people's willingness to change.
We've done all the adapting we could possibly do as sports fishermen, and the commercial fishery is just beginning. The Indian fishery seems to be cooperating. They seem to be starting to use, traps and weirs, and that's the answer. The commercial fishery, in order to survive, has to change too. It has to make changes. That's the only permanent thing in the world is change. And unless you are prepared to do it, you're going to hurt somebody.
At this point, the commercial fleet has not embraced the concept of using more selective fishing technology. There's a great deal of concern on the part of the commercial fleet that they would be faced with losing jobs, losing fishing opportunity if they went that route. That's created some more problems for us in meeting our commitment to the 50% reduction. We're going to have to seek ways of meeting that within the context of the existing fleet and how we are going to alter their fishing patterns, working with them to do that in order to meet the 50% reduction.
I've been writing about recreational fishing for 40 years, and in that time I've seen the Department of Fisheries go from ignoring recreational fishermen or sportsmen to tolerating the sportsmen to holding them at bay. Now they're in a sort of a watchdog position where they seem to be hiring the PR directors and managers that are yesing us to death, buttering us all up, but still not listening to our recommendations.
By avoiding the tough decisions that have to be made, bureaucrats continue to play politics with the long-term survival of wild salmon and steelhead. Yet solutions aren't hard to find.
If you really want to solve the problem, then you go at it like they did in the Soviet Union a few years ago, many years ago. You just put a weir across the river. This is on the Kamchatka Peninsula. They just put a weir across the river, and all the fish have got to come through the weir, and that's it. You don't have any nets to worry about. You can select which ones you're going to harvest and which ones you're going to let go upstream.
A selective terminal fishery could solve many problems. Instead of being caught in the ocean, where weak populations mingle with strong, target runs of salmon could be harvested according to their abundance, from tidewater to spawning areas. For commercial fishermen, a labor-intensive selective fishery could actually mean more jobs, more fish, and more revenue. And depleted runs of wild salmon and steelhead could be rebuilt and sustained forever. Wild steelhead are too precious to let slip away. The more we learn about the importance of biodiversity, the less acceptable extinction becomes. From the way we treat wild salmon stocks, we can discover much about our relationship to nature and the prospects for our own survival.